In this conversation, I speak with Satyavayu, whose writings I recently came across. He writes about spiritual traditions and practices, as well as environmental activism and engagement. Really wanted to have him on to speak about these things and learn more about him and his life and how he sees things. I really enjoyed this conversation. I feel very moved by it, and I'll be reflecting on it for quite a while. And I hope you'll enjoy it as well and take it into consideration for your own life and the people around you. So please enjoy. Thank you so much for joining me, Satyavayu. Really appreciate you joining.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so as I mentioned previously, I really like to just start by getting to know people and hearing about their story. And I've been very curious from reading your writings about your story and where you're coming from. So I'd love to hear anything that you have to share about, your spiritual path and your interest in activism and how that got started, and what, just take me through it in whatever length you'd like about kind of your life. Yeah.
Yeah. Could be a big subject.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, I like that you call it a story, because that's what it is, and I'll be recreating it now, and another time I might recreate it differently, and our memories are so faulty, and so it's just I'm aware it's somewhat of a fabrication, although not intentional, and I hope your listeners are as well. But in terms of I think my interest in environmental and ecological awareness and responsibility is quite tied to the burgeoning of my interest in spiritual practice too. And I grew up in New York City, so very urban, obviously, and a bit nature starved, I felt. So I always felt a strong connection to nature from an early age. The times we would go to the country were the most intense and beautiful for me in my childhood memories. So I started camping and backpacking pretty early on as a youngster. And I think that probably quite a few people can relate that experiences you have in the wilderness when you're outside of the physical manifestation of human thought and immersed in something that we can't intellectually understand, the miracle of life just emerging around us, living and growing around us. That's a first entryway for a lot of people into life beyond thought, life beyond intellectual construct, and the miracle and beauty of it, and beyond our own preoccupations with our temporary concerns and worries and human relations. So, I consider that the beginning of my spiritual practice, periods of time, especially alone in the woods. I started backpacking alone probably in my mid-teens. And in terms of spiritual practice, I don't really know how it started. It's quite mysterious. We can always say karma, mysterious karma. But I was really into writing as a school kid, creative writing, stories, and I wanted to be a writer. It was kind of my focus, and I had some talent and was encouraged by teachers. I remember that I wrote in 8th grade, I think it was, a story that had to do with a young person who had trouble speaking to a late age. It's based on a cousin of mine, and suddenly learned to speak. And I wrote it as if it was a reduction in their ability to perceive a more unlimited and unbounded view of the universe. So it had some kind of little inklings of non-duality that early. I think I had read some Salinger, and I don't know what my influences were. I had never studied any actual Asian religion, and I don't have anyone I can remember in my family who was interested. So somehow that was percolating in my consciousness. And I got involved a little bit in activism back then too, around that time, middle school and high school. I remember meeting someone on a bus who encouraged me to join the Sierra Club and this kind of thing. So obviously I was interested in saving as much as I could be of nature because of my love for it that was already developed at that time. My formal or more formal practice or influence with Asian religion would have been in college. I started studying it academically, Indian religion, Chinese, Japanese religion. And I had been very influenced by Krishnamurti at some point during those years, which had a big impact on me, I think, because Krishnamurti is so non-traditional in terms of his non-reliance on any kind of religious forms and ritual and identity and lineage and all that. And just kind of direct questioning of what our reality is beyond our thought. And so that has stayed with me as the fundamental. And as I've taken up religions and practiced in lineages and practiced different specific outer forms, I've kind of kept this sense of the ultimate inquiry or the ultimate practice is not tied to any of those things. And now in my life, I'm not practicing many of those more traditional forms, so I've kind of returned to that to some degree. But I led a class in my college because we had an experimental college where students can teach things. So I led one on Krishnamurti, kind of a discussion group. It was a little intimidating because there was a couple of women I remember from India who had grown up in Krishnamurti schools who joined the group. So, but they claimed not to be specialists in Krishnamurti, so it was all right. But I think it was my first year at college, there was a Zen group starting and I went to the formation meeting. So I must have been quite interested then, but it didn't keep going. And it wasn't until my last year, after I'd studied it academically somewhat and done quite a bit of reading, that the group started again and I joined it. And that was the first time I started sitting regularly. And I remember quite a strong experience the very first time, even just a 5-minute or 10-minute sit, and feeling like, wow, we're really allowed to just be. That's actually okay to not have to accomplish something. And from then on, I pretty much sat every day. I kind of took over the group and made it a meet every day, I think, and just a handful of people. And then I was, through that group, I became aware of someone who had a little more experience, a little more like a teacher in nearby Kent State. I was going to Oberlin College, so this is in Ohio, and Kent State was an hour or two away or something. And a man named Tim McCarthy had a house there. He was maybe at that time, maybe teaching, maybe a graduate student also, I'm not sure. But he had like a house that had a Zen theme, that had some sittings, and we kind of went for a very informal one-day sitting. And I met him and liked him, and he told me about his teacher who was Kobun Chino Roshi, and got me interested in meeting him. And I managed to graduate, even though my attention was moving strongly away from academics, and came out west and searched for Kobun. Basically, I went to his place in New Mexico first, thinking he was a normal teacher that would kind of live at a center or be regularly expected at a center, but he wasn't. He was a kind of poetic hermit wanderer type guy that was never very comfortable being a teacher, but had a lot of beauty in his expression and understanding of meditation to share with people when you did manage to find him. But I met some of the Sangha members and had a good connection, and went on to California and lived in the East Bay with some college friends, and started going regularly to Berkeley Zen Center. Worked a little with Mel Weitzman, who was I guess still is the teacher there. Maybe he's semi-retired now, getting on. And was also getting involved in direct action environmental protection at that time. Something called Redwood Summer was going on, where they wanted people to do direct action up at the Redwood Forest in Northern California. So I went up there a couple of times. And I remember Mel suggested to me that Tassajara would be a good place for me, since he saw I was pretty keen on training and pretty ambitious, and my love for sitting and how much I wanted to practice. And I expressed concern at that time that I felt there was such a need for environmental activism. I didn't want to kind of hide myself away in a monastery. And he said, well, try it for a year and there'll still be environmental problems when you come out. You can work on it. So that convinced me. I guess it didn't take much. And I went to Tassajara. And Tassajara being the one of the first Zen monasteries in the country, inland from Big Sur in California, and enjoyed that quite a bit. Was getting into the tradition and exploring the origins of it, the more traditional origins of it to an extent. At that time, I was also practicing with Kobe, and I had finally met him at his California place, Jikoji, in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And I'd done some sessions with him and formed some kind of connection with him, although it's very mysterious. And I don't know about other people's relationship with him, but I never felt like mine was buddy kind of thing. But once in a while, you'd see him and he'd say some interesting thing for you to chew on for a while. It's kind of like that. But after Tassajara, I wanted more strict training. I felt it was too lax, too westernized, and I was feeling like I wanted to try other teachers as well. So I started to getting keen on the idea of going to Asia. And I signed up for this intense 3-month retreat, which is pretty much like a 3-month session, which is what I think the traditional angos are, or were at one point. And it was for international students in Korea with the Kwanum School, started by Zen Master Seung-san. They're all over the world. They had this, they probably still do some form. They had a 3-month intensive retreat in Korea. And I wasn't familiar with the school, but I met with Seung-san at their Berkeley Center and asked for permission to join it. And he approved that. And shortly before going, there was a guy, gosh, I can't remember his name. I hope to reconnect with him one day. Really nice guy. I liked him, older than me and had been around the block. He was at Tassajara, and he had done this 3-month retreat before in Korea. So we would discuss it for a while since I was getting set for that. And he said, if you're going that far, you may as well stop off in Japan as well and check out this unusual place that not many people know about called Bukokuji. And so I said, that sounded like a good idea. And I did that. And I was very impressed with Bukokuji and the teacher there, Harada Tangen Roshi, who was really one of the recent greats and teachers. I think in Japan, most people have met him, concur with that. And I almost just wanted to stay there. He wanted me to stay there after 2 months, but I continued on to the 3-month thing in Korea that I was programmed to do. And then I went on to do a pilgrimage of India, which I had wanted to do. I had a great love for Indian culture and the origins of Buddhism. So I did the Buddhist pilgrimage there, and also did a long walk from Dharamsala across the Himalayas to Leh, Ladakh, which is politically in India, but a Tibetan Buddhist culture, basically. And really, that made a big impact on me in many ways. It's the only real traditional culture that I've ever encountered in person in my life. And there's so few of them left in the world that it's a pretty rare thing, more rare today now than even then. But when you get several days walk from the nearest road, the villages are very, very traditional. I mean, people were just farming as they always had and wearing traditional clothes and very few TVs, if any, in those small villages. And pretty amazing how settled and relaxed people seem to be compared to what I had grown up with. And the beauty of the landscape and their ecologically harmonious way of living was just so impressive. And in many ways, I was tempted to want to stay there, you know, make a life for myself there somehow. But I also knew they were doomed. You could see the roads being built then by the Indian government, and TVs coming in, and the young people being taught that their culture was backward and they had to get money. And you could see change was happening. And I felt being in my own culture where all this was coming from, or one of the origin spots of it, might be the best help for me to return to and work on creating alternatives here. So I did return to the States after that trip, but then wanting more training at the place I had visited in Japan, Bukokuji, seemed like the best bet. And I talked to Kobun about that, and I was actually ordained then as a priest by Kobun. It's interesting, before going to India, I felt I was totally dedicated to practice and wanted to make my life focused on it. But it seemed like the priest ordination thing was just a extra baggage, extra formality, cultural stuff that your ego can attach to, and I wasn't so interested. But after being in India and seeing cultures, you know, both Ladakh with their Tibetan Buddhist culture, but also India with their yogic renunciant culture, I saw that the people who were recognizable as full-time practitioners in some way, whether monks or sadhus or whatever they might be, had a real role in society in terms of inspiring people, in terms of creating a balance in their culture, keeping the values of simplicity really strong, keeping the spiritual values reinforced against the onslaught of interest in money and other less wholesome, we can say, or ultimately satisfying pursuits. And so I realized getting ordained it wasn't so much for me. It wasn't about what I identify it as, but it was a gesture for others, for the wider community, to be recognizable as someone people could approach or just get inspired by, even if, you know, it was just the sight of you. You know, Sung San used to have a saying that just putting on the robe saves all beings from suffering.
Mm. Mm.
So that's why I asked to get ordained at that point. And after some months, that happened. But Kobun wasn't much of a trainer, as I mentioned before. He just appears and disappears for a little while. His centers are pretty lax in terms of discipline, and which is, you know, I now appreciate much more, I think, than I did then. But I was a eager beaver in my 20s, and so I asked him if I could go to Bukokuji, even though it was a different teacher, which some Japanese people get a little uppity about. And he was fine with, and off I went. And for the next 5 years, I was basically at Bukokuji training, which was pretty vigorous, satisfied my interest in vigor, satisfied my interest for an inspirational teacher, and really could see the roots of Japanese Zen, because you know, the Japanese culture has changed so radically from its traditional roots these days. That the little island of secluded island I was in was pretty traditional. We grew a lot of our own food. We picked herbs from the mountainside, and the training was pretty full on. There wasn't a lot of ritual and hierarchy and a lot of things people complain about from Japanese culture that really has very little to do with Zen, but has crept in from the culture. It was a pretty informal place in that sense, and the teacher he just wanted you to sit a lot and hear his teachings, which were pretty simple and repeated over and over again, just about letting go and being present. And he didn't want people to learn Japanese. He says, we have enough problems with English. We should be getting another language. Just stop talking so much and go sit. And it was a very small temple. We didn't have much to take care of. We didn't have a lot of work to do. was quite a bit of free time, but also a lot of sitting, a lot of sessions. And he was just very inspirational and quite active at that time. He started to fade. He was in his 70s, I think, at that time. So after I had left, he, was getting on. He would still do some tagatsu with us, though, still do some begging with us, the shorter trips. It was amazing in his 70s. So I left most summers and came back to the States, visit Koben, visit my parents. Summers, there were no sessions, and it was really hot and muggy there. But most of the rest of the year I was there for 5 years or so. And at the beginning, I was very inspired about that lifestyle, and felt that my practice was deepening substantially. But after a while, for me, you get used to anything, and it was less transformative, and I was getting a little more interested in exploring other avenues in my life. I had never really explored intimate relationships, so it was pretty unusual in that sense. In high school and college, I had never been in relationships, and so I was quite curious about that at this point, and didn't really want to have a celibate life. And I think I just felt done with that particular limited structure, really appreciative of it, but also that I wanted to move on. But I wasn't quite done, actually. I was interested in how it was in China, and I was interested in pushing myself a little farther. And I did go to China. First time, actually, I got rejected by the Chinese. They told me before I got on the boat from Japan that they'd give me a visa when I got there. And then I got there and someone else was working. They were like, nah, you don't have enough money. And I was in robes. They didn't like that. So I had to go back to Japan. But the next year, after getting a visa in San Francisco, I took that same boat and actually got into Shanghai.
Wow.
I went to I had done a little research before and written a letter to a monastery. They were very happy to have me. I had to get it translated and everything because there wasn't much English. That's the main reason I was going, was the Kokuji was about half Westerners, and there was quite a bit of English. So you could chat and gossip in your free time. And we were, of course, encouraged not to, but we all did. And I thought it might be good to be in a place where no one spoke English, and I really had nothing to do but practice. And I visited several monasteries for a very short time, just a couple of days, and then I went to one that I was going to stay at for a little longer. It was really romantic. I mean, out in the woods, out in a mountaintop in the countryside, and traditional spot. I think someone's made a little movie you can see on the internet about it. It's Zhen, I don't know how to pronounce it right because Chinese is hard. Zhenrushi was the temple name. The mountain was Yunjushan, cloud covered mountain. So this is Yunju Daoying, I think. My memory is serving me. I haven't looked these things up in so long, but he was one of the main disciples of Dongshan, the founder of the Saodong lineage in China. So that was the site of his monastery. The actual building, I think, had been rebuilt not too long ago, but famous Zen site from classical golden age of Zen. And a big monastery, one of the 3 or 4 at that time known in China in the late 90s to be reviving Zen practice, really authentic Zen practice. And it was full on all day. Sitting in the Zendo. Not everyone in the monastery is doing Zen. They're kind of universal Buddhist monasteries, but the Zen hall was like the special elite place, and some people sleeping in there. I got a separate room, which was nice. They were quite happy to have me. I was the only Westerner, very little English, and they do some things differently than Japan, and so it was interesting to see what was different and what was really the same. What was the essence, They're very informal there. They're very earthy. They laugh and smile and give you a big hug, and they're loud and they yell. So all those things are quite different from Japan, but the practice was really strong. And yeah, I enjoyed it quite a bit, but I also, it was probably a little much. I was pushing myself a little much, and not having anyone to speak to. Sometimes in stressful situations, I had experienced a little bit that I can fall into some OCD tendencies, and I had that on a little bit on the Korean retreat years before, and I didn't want that to happen again, and so I left a little prematurely, or earlier than I had planned to, and I went to Hong Kong, and then I did actually have a hard time in Hong Kong for a while with my mind, so. I was saved by an airline attendant who befriended me. She was a Buddhist. She studied Tibetan Buddhism. Really wonderful woman who could see I was having a hard time and thought, to fulfill your vows, you have to take care of this, and you need to go home. And she flew me back as her guest on her next flight to San Francisco. So
wow.
It was quite beautiful, and I still traveled around the States a little bit and did a couple more retreats with some other teachers that I was curious about that I hadn't met. But at that point, my kind of formal monastic thing was pretty much over, and I wanted to see how a dedication to presence practice and sitting practice and allied arts that I now engage in could function in our culture and could function outside the context of a formal monastery, and just exploring, I think, and that's what it's been for the last 20 years. I've mostly been in the Northwest, mostly in Portland. I was pretty dedicated to continue to live really simply in the mold of traditional renunciates. Whether I was formally considered a monk or not, I didn't really care anymore. But I wanted to see if I can live without an income, which sometimes meant sleeping out in the rough. Although I tended to have some shelters worked out for the rainy season at least. And also I got back into more formal environmental activism. I was doing some tree sitting, some old growth preservation work in the Northwest. And I was trying to bridge the two and teach meditation out there to the forest activists. And there was some interest in that. It was interesting, but it was a little hard to bridge. Yeah, that's the kind of more exciting part of the story. The last 20 years is less to tell about, but I studied some various other arts that I wanted to supplement a kind of more bare bones sitting practice with, especially out of the monastery when you don't have chanting as much and you don't have the kind of other things that are automatically part of it in the monastery. Even prostration practice, I now realize is a really interesting physical practice, and the chanting is more substantial than I had thought. Because sometimes in a monastery you just feel, well, I'm doing those things, but the sitting is the real heart of it, at least in the Zen tradition, right? But I think those all have an interesting role to play. So I've studied Tai Chi here, a couple of different forms, and I practice that pretty regularly, and Qigong. And raga practice, which is Indian music practice. It's the basis of Indian classical music. They use these modes called ragas. The way I do it is just using the ragas as a kind of a meditation practice. So I don't develop it with the technical skills that you might in classical music training. But I sing and play the flute with that. And I studied with a flute teacher for a little while and a singing teacher. So those are kind of added to my repertoire. And I started a Sunday sitting group many years ago. We usually meet outside, so kind of combining with my nature interest, and a little challenging for some people in the winter. Not a lot of people joining us who are wrapped in blankets, but more people joining in the summer sometime. Never really did much outreach, so it's always stayed pretty small and informal. And these days, it's pretty much sitting and some qigong, and then kind of a satsang, kind of open-ended question and answer thing. And I do my best to give responses to people, and other people can chime in. So that's been going on for a long time. And as far as my activism, I'm not doing so much direct action anymore stuff, but I try to join with some events when they're happening, especially with Extinction Rebellion recently. That's a direct action group focusing on climate change, and I think that's a good place to go. But I think my focus on what you might call activism is just trying to live a life with the least impact as possible, and model that for other people, that we can live joyful, fulfilling lives by really radically reducing our impact. And our culture is, our usual ways of life in modern American culture is so dependent on destructive industries almost constantly, from the electronic equipment we're using, and the airplanes we use, and the cars we use, and just all the things we buy. I mean, those are the main things. And it is very hard to understand how to let go of that. But it always seemed to me that spiritual practitioners, particularly in the Buddhist tradition, should be natural pioneers in that. If we take the lessons to heart of our tradition, which is really that full contentment and joy and freedom from suffering exists in being fully awake of the present. That's where it comes from. It doesn't come from all those other things. So we should be primed to be able to let go of those things more easily than other people. And of course, the Buddha modeled that lifestyle. He lived intentionally homeless and with nothing, and all his monks lived that way too. So it's so clear in our early tradition. But the way Buddhism is generally transmitted in this country, as the other Western countries, and perhaps now also the Asian countries, is kind of the philosophy and the meditation specific practices kind of separated out from the lifestyle, and the lifestyle we're living not challenged so much. So, keep whatever job you want, very rarely challenged, and maybe what you eat is challenged to some degree, but not so much. And money is not challenged so much. And I think that loses a lot of the context. I mean, even in modern times, if you enter a monastery, your life has to simplify to some degree. And certainly where I was in Japan, it was very simple. And none of us were buying anything, basically, maybe a toothbrush or something. And we didn't need money. The teacher would give us money sometimes, so we'd have enough so we could leave, so we didn't feel economically trapped at the monastery. But even though we collected alms on begging rounds, that just went to the monastery. And such freedom with that lifestyle, such an ease, so beautiful. And as I said, after a while, it felt too restrictive, and I wanted to explore other things, which I think is natural. But just to have a set community, not worry about your social life, not worry about bills and finances, and even healthcare. Healthcare was covered if something came up, but and to be doing something every day that resonated with your heart, and to have an inspiring teacher around. It's a beautiful thing. I don't think it's restricted to just formal training monasteries. I think you can get a lot of that beauty from other kind of spiritual communities or ashrams that might not have a very vigorous schedule. But I think that's a big part of the beauty of monastic life is actually the community, the Sangha, in addition to what's usually talked about, which is just the practices or the teacher. So in my present life, I'm really focused on how to create more Sangha, because I am pretty isolated right now. I've been given a house to use for a while with the idea for Sangha, and then coronavirus happened, so that ran into some roadblocks. But the isolation is difficult, and it's even difficult for me. I've done a lot of things in my life alone, a lot of practices alone, some private retreats, which can be very helpful. But I'm feeling it, and going through some rough mental times even, and trying to be really open and sharing that with people. And to me, Sangha is so crucial. warmth of realizing the significance of your body mind is really in how you're helping others. And that's also the easiest, I think, and maybe most profound way to really let go of self-concern, is just involve yourself with others. You know? So that bodhisattva vow. So that's kind of my focus now. Okay, that was a pretty long story. So
it's a beautiful, beautiful answer. Thank you for sharing so much. There's a lot in there, and I think if I'm understanding you correctly from what you've said and also from your writings, it seems like, you know, you've done, you know, you've had for a long time this connection to nature and a desire to be involved in environmental activism. And, you know, you did Buddhist monastic training and were kind of exposed to some other traditions as well. It seems like, if I'm understanding correctly, like now your life is not necessarily connected to a particular lineage, that you're just trying to live a simple life where you do practices and model simplicity for the world as a kind of renunciate practitioner without necessarily being tied to a specific lineage or tradition or even set of spiritual practices. You're just trying to live the life that seems best to you right now in your own sense of integrity. Does that seem true?
Yeah, sure. That's definitely true. You know, there was a time where I was getting a little anti-lineage, and I still feel that for a lot of people, it's definitely helpful if you're doing traditional practice in a lineage to really keep the question alive, how much the lineage affiliation, the teacher affiliation, has just become part of another ego structure, another part of your identity that you hold around and protect and defend. And I think it can be a big problem. That's not to say that it's necessarily a problem or that you can't let go of that and still practice within a lineage because it's practically helpful. But I know there's a lot of attachment to teachers and a particular way. And I think to really be free in the present, we need to not even be so attached to our lineage and our teacher and you know, competing ways. And it's the great opportunity of our time and place. There's so much difficult challenge about our time and place with ecological destruction and technological control and kind of isolation I think we all feel with community breakdown in more kind of urban capitalist society. So there's a lot of challenges, but perhaps the most beautiful positive is all these cultures come together, all these different traditions are available to us, at least to learn about. Maybe in some deep way, they're harder to really pummel, really dig into the depths of than in another time. But we're exposed to so many of these, and we can see the commonality of them and how they all express the same kind of beauty and connection and dropping of self in different ways and for different people. And you know, there's so much beauty in the Sufi tradition, you know, and being a musical person, being interested in music, I just, you know, I resonate with that so much. And the Japanese chanting tradition, I love that too. And there's a certain wonderful energy in it, but it actually it doesn't do the same thing for me, or that it doesn't get the emotions in the same way, you know, including the emotions. And I was talking recently to a Christian practitioner who has kind of a deeper contemplative side of Christianity, and actually I've known and appreciated that side for a while because I once did a retreat at a place in Austria that was co-founded by Brother David Stumder-Ross, this great Benedictine mystic. He had a connection to someone in Copen's lineage, and really appreciated his stuff. And there's an angle to the same subject that they use that you don't find as pronounced in Buddhism. Just like Buddhism has an angle that's not as pronounced in Christian contemplative practice or Sufism, or you know, the non-dual, less traditional tradition, you call it that I've been I've been enriched by recently listening to people like Rupert Spira, who's very articulate in presenting presence in a way a little different from Buddhism. And some other teachers. I like Lisa Cairns a lot, who's just very untraditional in many ways, you know, and there's a kind of an honesty and freedom and acceptance of all these different forms that I find enriching. I mean, I have to say right now in my life, I'm trying to work on a kind of broadening and acceptance, because the downside of living, you know, a lot of people have given me a lot of appreciation and respect for the degree that I live a simple life, that I don't use cars and planes and you know, use money very, very sparingly and all that. And I'm happy about that on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's, you know, I understand the main reason people don't do it isn't, I don't think, isn't because they love comfort so much. There's a little bit of that. I don't think that's the strongest thing. Habit is a big part of it for sure. But I actually think the biggest thing that keeps people from radically changing their life is the isolation. Is that we're social creatures and we want to do what the people around us are doing. And if changing our life is going to make us just not included in so many groups, it's really hard psychologically. And I'm feeling that probably more than I have before. And so in a certain sense, I feel like I have to let go of some of that, you know. And we can make our identity out of anything. And I've certainly made an identity for myself out of living really simply. And that needs to be challenged too. It's not that living simply isn't beautiful, but being attached to it is not beautiful. And making an identity about it is not beautiful. And being inflexible is not beautiful. And the inevitable feeling that other people aren't included, even though it's not your conscious intention, of course, everyone's included and I accept everyone. You can say that consciously to yourself. But when you're living a certain way that's pretty radical, it's very hard to, at least it's been hard for me, not on some deep subconscious emotional level, not to feel really separate, you know. And that's kind of my work now, you know, how to keep an inspirational model that's different from the mainstream when the mainstream obviously has some unwholesome components, or a lot of unwholesome components, but how to also really accept those unwholesome components. You might work to try to change them, but you also have to really accept them. And certainly you have to accept the people caught up in them. And of course, we're all caught up in them to various degrees in various ways, but any deep change, any deep positive change for our culture going forward, I think has to come ultimately from a place of joy and inclusivity and freedom. So if you're not feeling that, you're not going to be the best vessels for making that change. And so that's something we all have to keep in mind, I think.
I'd be curious to ask you, like, a somewhat simple question, but to hear your sense of it or how you would describe it. It's really the same question, but from two angles of, like, one, how do you understand what spiritual practice is and what it's aiming for or working towards? And then sort of similarly, how do you right now understand the problems that we're facing ecologically and environmentally? How do you perceive that problem and understand it?
Yeah. I mean, what is spiritual practice? It's always nice with those big questions to go to etymology a little. So spiritus is, I think, the Latin for breath, something like that, breathing, which is quite nice because it's just the intimate thing that's happening in the moment. Pretty much always, if you're doing some Wim Hof thing or some Kundalini yoga thing, holding your breath for a while, it still involves breath. So, and religion also is a nice word, even though it has some not so nice connotations these days. But, you know, reconnection basically means reconnection to the whole, you might say. So, for me, coming from a contemplative meditative tradition, I would just say spiritual practice is when you enter presence well, not when you enter presence, but is the direction of your life of turning toward presence. And presence meaning awareness itself when free, seeing the freedom from our thoughts. The thoughts that create the self is the central thought that causes the weight and burden. So entering into awareness so that we feel the freedom from our thoughts, even though our thoughts continue. And I think pretty much all the contemplative traditions will correspond to that. They might call that a vision of God or transcendence of the self or whatever you might have. So, so many ways. I would say when people talk about being in the zone and in sports, in intense sports or intense artistic, particularly the performance arts, but maybe all the arts, or sex, or what are the other things that bring us into presence easily for most culture? I mean, I don't know if sex does most of the time for a lot of people, or for a very short amount of time. But anyway, all those things, I consider that legitimate presence, and the freedom and joy you feel is legitimate. I think the difference with spiritual practice is you recognize that as a direction for your life, and you recognize that as something to being open to access anytime, not being connected to a particular activity. And so we still use particular activities like sitting, but they get more and more minimal, so that it can be a more and more universal experience. So anything one does to help you enter into presence, but specifically that is leading you to not be dependent on that one activity, but leading you to approach a presence all the time, I would call spiritual practice. So the understanding that you can approach it all the time is the wisdom aspect. You can call the samadhi aspect the actual, generally temporary experience of it. That was what's spirituality. What was the next part? I can't remember.
Sort of a similar thing, but just how do you currently see the environmental and ecological problems that we're facing? How do you make sense of those or understand them?
Yeah. From the biggest picture of acceptance, it's just what the universe needs to do. It's just how it's happening, and it needs to be accepted on that level, or else we're always going to be, we're always going to be upset about it. I mean, some level of emotional upset is fine. It's what the body does. It's the relative realm is part of our consciousness, and when our friend gets hurt, we feel sad, and when nature gets destroyed, we feel sad. We're at all sensitive, and when we're faced with the extinction of so many creatures and possible human extinction, that's sad, and it should be sad, and we should do something about it. But on another level, we have to also see it's all nature. It's all part of it. And that's been hard for me, because those of us who are very sensitive about environmental issues get very attached to needing to stop them. But I don't think that attachment makes us better change makers, actually. It doesn't make us stop. We just get more frustrated, maybe more despairing, maybe give up, more. So on the one level, the ultimate level, we have to understand it as we're all nature. We're always all nature. Everything human beings do is nature. There's only nature. And it's all okay. And yet, the quote from Suzuki Roshi, we're perfect as we are, and yet we could use some improvement. So the side that we're perfect as we are needs to be touched if we're not going to suffer, but also we live out our human lives responding to the most natural emotions we have to help beings, the bodhisattva activity. It's that bodhisattva role of one foot in equanimity and one foot in compassionate action. And ultimately, it's not something you can figure out or chart or map, right, intellectually. I mean, you can, but I don't think it's so helpful. ultimately it's just some balance you have to discover kind of from your own heart. And so certainly we can see that the environmental destruction as it's happening is being led from the essential spiritual ignorance of humanity, that true satisfaction and joy is in presence, is in awareness, and we always have it. And instead we think it's in getting things. And most practically speaking, that turns in our present culture, that turns into money. And most of the in the relative, maybe not the deepest sense, but in the functional sense, conventionally functional sense, the desire for money generally of people who have so much money already that they don't know what to do with it. They couldn't possibly spend it, but they still have. It's an obsession. It's a kind of a mental disorder, and I think it should be recognized as that. That once you have the habit of always wanting to acquire more money, even though you have so much, you can't use it. You just want to acquire more, and you're willing to destroy the whole earth for it. I don't think people in those positions of power are thinking they're destroying the earth, but they must be aware on some level that that's what's happening. So it's that essential feeling of dissatisfaction and lack that we're trying to fill with money or power or entertainment or whatever it is that leads us to have developed this lifestyle that's so hard on the planet. And at this point, a lot of it's just led by habit. It's what we grew up with. It's what the people around us are doing. So it's got its own cycle that's just continuing. And when we're told everything that you do in your regular daily life, everything you buy, at least, every energy use you use is destroying the planet, it's overwhelming. And we don't see people around us doing something much different. So we just have to go into denial, or look for technological solutions, or look for halfway measures that will slowly reduce our through whatever will slowly reduce our impact, but that when you're honest and look at what the science is saying is not going to be nearly enough. So really radical lifestyle change is what's necessary to make a serious impact. But it's psychologically really hard to do. So that's the place we're at. And so I think spiritual practices of all kinds could be such a help to that. But when I see mostly how they're offered, most teachers and centers shy away from really challenging people on their lifestyle stuff. So there's this idea that, well, people will just, if they just meditate or do whatever their practice is and discover a letting go of self, they'll be more primed to simplify their life and drop a lot of the destructive habits, and it'll be easier. And maybe that's true. I mean, it's certainly true to some extent, I guess you could say, but I have my doubts. I think meditation practice and non-dual teaching and this kind of thing, they're beautiful in themselves, and they certainly can lead to a lot of relief, psychological relief. But to go deeply with it, to see all its implications and how you would live a different life if you're really unattached to the things that we're emotionally attached to and habitually attached to, that really has to be pointed out by teachers or taught in some way, I think, or exemplified at least. And if that's not being done, then I don't know if these traditional religious practices are going to lead people to be to make that kind of change. So I don't know how to do it. I'm trying to model that life, and as I said, also try to balance it with acceptance and inclusivity, a sense of including people, not being too steep for people when they're coming to it, and also go out to the streets when there's some community doing that. Extinction Rebellion has done some wonderful things, and the last one that was here in Portland is still really small in the States, although they've had some impressive numbers in England. But the small thing I went to recently in Portland was quite beautiful. I help bring food to it because I work with Food Not Bombs, this group that collects food that would otherwise might go to waste, and just distributes it in parks regularly every week, a couple times a week. So we also bring it to some of these actions, and there was a lot of good smiles and energy. And so even, who knows what it'll accomplish, if anything, but at least it's a good way to reach out to community and express our emotional pain and what's going on, and also express our need to connect with each other and help each other. And maybe to start sharing ways we can live that's different. And you never know if something suddenly takes off. I mean, people changed their lives quite quickly with coronavirus because they were afraid of the virus or afraid of who knows why, social stigma, if they didn't follow the rules. But people did change their life quite a bit. So if somehow people become aware of the severity of the climate situation, particularly the extinction crisis and biodiversity crisis, all the rest of it, which is so intimately related, as is the psychological crisis our cultures have and our lack of community. I mean, it's also deeply, and social justice and civil rights, of course, it's also deeply intertwined. But some fights are easier to jump on. I mean, Black Lives Matter for a lot of people, I think, is easier to jump on because even a lot of white people, although there's quite a bit of white guilt, I think even a lot of white people can kind of say, well, it's those racist cops, it's those other people. Of course, we'll go yell at how bad they are. But with climate change, you have to look at your own life and say, I have to change my life. I'm contributing to it. Of course, you can say it's all the corporations, but and that's a fine angle to do activism with. I'm not saying not to do that. And of course, most of the pollution is coming from corporations, but the corporations are making things for you to buy. That's why it's happening. So it's not like they're on their own planet doing their destruction and it has nothing to do with us. So we have to look to ourselves. And obviously, I do believe spiritual revolution in ourselves is crucial. But I think maybe not just the direct practices that are being offered at most centers today. I don't know if has enough direct line to the kind of lifestyle change that I see as necessary for averting some of these catastrophic things that are in the pipeline. I mean, really in the very near term, next 10 years. But as I said, on the other hand, we have to be okay with it. And more people will join positive movements if we smile, if we dance. I went to a dance thing. There's this dance community at a park nearby here. And I didn't used to go to these things, but after this COVID time and the isolation, I was like, I got to get to something. And I used to love to dance, so, but I don't do it much. And it was great. It was great. There's some great quote from some activist. Is it Emma Goldman or something that if you can't dance, I don't want to be part of your revolution, something like that. Anyway, I think that's true. You have to dance, and your dance might be sitting practice and Tai Chi or whatever, but it might be good to actually include some dancing too. Come to think of it.
I'm all about the dance personally.
Practice that I happen to love, but you got to balance the silence and the stillness with some noise and some music and some moving too, I think. Definitely community. I mean, there's beautiful times to be alone when you're feeling strength with that. But I think the real power of being alone is realizing you're never alone. To discover that is the point of private retreat, I think. You sit in the woods alone, you're like, oh my God, everything.
Yeah.
The clouds, the trees, you're never apart from it. Once my teacher Coben said, because he liked to do a lot of alone practice, and he used to advocate it actually, which is pretty rare in Zen circles. And Zen circles are mostly advocating together practice, right? It's a Chinese cultural thing. But he said you go on private retreat because you separate yourself from other people and from community, and it's like a rubber band. You're stretching a rubber band. And it gets more and more intense as you go farther and farther out until eventually the power of it becomes so clear that it just brings you back. And that power is love. It's really to clarify love that you go away, not to get away from people. I mean, it's fine to get away from the distraction temporarily, but it's all about our belonging ultimately, and that's what our heart wants, and really making that clear. And I think we have to work on that our whole lives, as long as we're in these apparently appearing separate bodies.
That clarifies a lot for me. I've been feeling really called to dance recently in the last months, and I'm like, oh, now I know why. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
I do want to, you mentioned that in a lot of centers and traditions, there isn't this, like questioning of lifestyle and practices, and that you think that, radical intervention and lifestyle change is necessary for solving these problems at the consumer level. And I want to ask you about that. But first, can you say just what are the interventions that you're recommending? What that people take up, or some of them? Like you alluded to this earlier, that you don't drive places and you don't use planes and you try to use money sparingly. What are some of the other things that you're really recommending to people and suggesting that people take up if they do care about the planet and are willing to make changes in their life?
Yeah. Well, I don't think it's a big mystery. Everyone has different strategies about how to introduce it and how slow to go or how fast to go. And I have not much to say. I mean, it's different for every individual and every karma. And I think a deep understanding and non-judgmentalism is really important. Actually, to be honest, I don't like using that word judgmentalism, because we always make judgments. Whenever we're not in samadhi, we're making a judgment, right? Whenever we're not in total choiceless presence, we're making judgments, and that's fine. That's what our mind does. I think when people say don't be judgmental, what they really mean is don't put me down. Don't devalue me, right? Don't belittle me or show me care and concern. So I think we have to remember, whatever our judgments might be, to really try to show care and concern and love. And I'm totally guilty of making people feel not included and not respected because of how strong I can get about, it feels like concern for spreading this message and changing the world, But we've got to find a way to spread it with the concern and love for the other person as part of the package. So, the actual steps to take, I think, are pretty clear. In terms of our personal life, we all have to drive much less. We all have to use much less fossil fuels in general, so that the other major use might be heating your home and flying, of course. And then buying stuff, especially electronics, which we're all addicted to now. I'm using it, and I don't tell anyone not to use it. I don't have a phone, it's true, but I've been thinking about getting one. But I would get a used one that someone else is discarding, And all the computers I use are ones that people have moved on from, getting used ones. And there's a lot of those. So you can improve on those situations, but just to create one computer uses an unbelievable amount of resources and water and all of that. And then what we eat is another big one. So the less animals we can eat, it's pretty clear it's better for the environment. There's people that will argue, there's regenerative agriculture that says, oh, it's needed for permaculture and stuff to have animals, but those arguments don't seem to hold much water. There's better ways to have animals and worse ways, and we can transition, but the less animals we depend on, we can use less land. We actually grow less plants if we're not raising animals, even if we're eating all plants. And the emissions result is much less, aside from the whole ethical issue of cruelty to animals and also the health issue, which I've done some study of, and I'm pretty convinced it's healthier to eat less animal products, but that's endlessly controversial. I shouldn't get into. So yeah. More plant-based diet, less cars, less fossil fuels in general, put a sweater on instead of heating your home, buy less stuff, especially intense stuff like electronics and cars, of course, and big stuff. Of course, try to not do plastic packaging. I haven't bought plastic packaging in more than 20 years. Of course, it's easier for me if you live in a more progressive place that has stores that sell in bulk. Then that's easier. And if you don't have a place, of course, you have to make some compromises if you're going to eat the way our culture is set up. But, whatever you can grow yourself, whatever you can get in bulk. what else? Flying, I mentioned. So those are the personal things, or some of them anyway. I might be missing some. And those have to change. What some people who are trying to, in some ways, I think, are rightly pointing out that we shouldn't put the weight on ourselves and blame ourselves for participating in this system when it's being engineered to some degree by corporations, largely through advertising and or just from owning a market and not giving you any alternatives, and the government from supporting those corporations and doing those practices. So it's true that some of the big decisions are made by those corporations and the government. But it's also true that we all have to stop participating in them. And so it becomes a question of strategy, whether you're going to try to spread it on the grassroots as a personal lifestyle change thing, or whether you're going to try to petition the government and corporations, or do activism, direct action against corporations and the government to make them change. But ultimately, that means we're basically forcing the rest of us to change our lifestyle, because and we can make it easier for the rest of us to change our lifestyle by forcing the corporations to give alternatives, to not put things in disposable plastic packaging, to make alternatives to food more widely available, to make public transportation more widely available so we don't feel the need to use cars as much. That's all totally true. But even in places that have a lot of public transportation available, people still are attached to their cars. So those habits have to be broken somehow. Whether it's we the people do it ourselves amongst ourselves, which to me is kind of more beautiful, or whether we get the government to make policy to require the rest of the population to do it, which seems less beautiful to me, but might be what's more practically workable in the short term. It seems like if we're gonna, to the extent we're gonna heal and not create as much destruction as we could, I think all of these paths will have to be used. So we'll have to petition the government, we'll have to petition corporations, we'll have to do boycotts, we'll have to do marches, and we'll have to change our lifestyle, and we'll have to educate each other, and we'll have to really make it easier to change your lifestyle. And we'll have to do spiritual practice so that we're psychologically equipped to deal with the changes that are going to happen. I think it's much easier to deal with changing your lifestyle intentionally than to have to deal with, just one day the supermarkets don't have food on their shelves because of droughts all over the place. And then what are we going to do? People are going to freak out. People are going to freak out anyway for what's coming down the pike. And the more we're ready and flexible and can find our source of joy in just presence, and are creating community, and are already learning how to love each other and how to understand and how to deal with each other's psychological disturbance, the more prepared we're going to be when that stuff happens. So all of those paths. And I include them all in spiritual practice. It's also related. Once you really have a taste of presence is everything, then your habits are, at least intellectually, you realize my habits shouldn't be a big deal. And we still have emotional attachment, but we can start working on letting them go. And then if we really have that contentment and acceptance, we can bring that kind of positive attitude to the people around us that are really suffering. And then we're forming community. And once we have community, people can change their habits much quicker. Like I said before, we want to do what the people around us are doing. And if we enter a community, even if 20, 30 people, even if 10 people, even if 5 people who are doing things in a more wholesome way, it's so much easier for us to do that than if we don't know anyone. I mean, that's super hard. There's just very few of us that radically change our lives when we don't know anyone doing that around us. I've done it a little bit in my life, but it's hard for me too. And so forming communities of change are so important. I mean, the older I get and experience with practice, if that's happening, if I'm not regressing, I don't know, the more I realize Sangha is really the center of it. It's really the center. The Buddha is some carrot on a stick that, inspires us at the beginning and gets us going forward. We think about our potential for awakening. And the Dharma is very helpful to have certain practices, if we call practices the Dharma, and also teachings, to hear things, word, and so. But it's all kind of beginning for me. Really, it's Sangha. It's when we realize we're interconnected with everyone, and our field of practice is really loving and caring for each other, which includes caring for the earth, of course. When we understand who we really are, we're all those things. That's all part of awareness. It's our very bodies, and to know that and to embrace it and to sing with it and to dance with it is what our hearts really want. And you know, when people are not doing that and are cutting it down, our hearts respond. Yeah. So that's very general, but the actual
helpful
strategy, who knows? Nobody knows. We're suddenly put into this crash course, right? And we don't have a lot of time. And I do think people should at least recognize big changes are happening, and our usual lifestyles are not going to cut it. Our usual spiritual practices are not going to cut it. That doesn't mean they're not great and we won't still do them, but they're not sufficient enough for this time and place. And our usual communities are not going to do it. We have to make our communities more resilient and more ready for what's going to happen. And we just have to be open to new inspiration. Everything's transforming, you know, even if it's just all these traditions coming together, you know, that's our wonderful, as I said earlier in the interview, that's our wonderful light from this time amidst all the dangers. I think something more resilient and more universal can emerge from all these traditions mixing and sharing with each other, and us finally seeing what's the kernel, you know, and realizing it's not the dogma, it's not the things that separate each group from each other. Yeah.
You spoke to this to some extent, but I'd be curious to hear you speak about it a little bit more. Of I noticed as I was preparing for this conversation, reading your work, the biggest sort of objection that came up in me, and you spoke to it again today and in some of your writings as well, but is sort of like, okay, these changes seem good, yeah, but how is it that if I make changes in my own life, that's going to actually solve these enormous, complex, systemic, global problems if I choose not to fly or choose not to drive or you know, go without heat or, you know, don't use plastic or things like that? How is it brought about that that's the first step in that direction?
Yeah, I know, that's a tricky one. I mean, it's on one level, it's just the same question as like voting, right? It's like,
yeah,
how is my one vote going to, you know, there's millions of people voting. How is one vote going to change? So I won't vote. And then a lot of people do that. Half the country doesn't vote, and it makes a huge difference, you know? So one of it is just recognizing you're one drop in the ocean, and the ocean is made of drops. And that's the objection I have when some people say, oh, it's not personal change, it's the corporations. So they're kind of saying it's not the drops that make the ocean. It's there's a separate ocean, and then there's us, the drops, and we're different. But that's not really true. I mean, it is the drops that make the ocean. There are, I don't know how to extend this metaphor beyond its usefulness, but there are some drops that seem to make more decisions than others, and corral the other drops in certain directions, and we should address that for sure. You know, advertising is a huge thing, and the danger of advertising, and it's now expanding right through online stuff and through data mining, and we have to be aware of that. I remember reading once in a Taoist book, this was probably back in college when I was studying these things academically. There's a wonderful book called Taoism, The Parting of the Ways by Holmes Welch, I think. This stuff stays in my mind. I can't remember friends' names off on the street, but 20 years, 30 years ago. Anyway, he had an afterword that was more imaginative than the rest of the book, about what it would be like if he met Lao Tzu on the street, you know, and what Lao Tzu would say. And he had Lao Tzu first saying, I don't want to talk at all. Let's just be in silence, you know. And then the Holmes Welch character, the author character, would say, come on, you know, leave something for us. We need some more information, more than the Tao Te Ching, because now we're in a new time. We need it updated, right? And he said, okay, well, if I have to say something, the worst thing going on in your culture is advertising. Because it's creating nuance to people. And what our spiritual practice, I think that the core of all true contemplative spiritual practice is realizing that desire is that illusion, that we have what we need. We have it in awareness. We don't need something else. And advertising is committed to getting us to want something else always, and more and more and more and more. So yeah, I mean, if we could change the advertisers, that would help a lot more than any other one person or any group of people, But that's hard. I don't know how to do it. There's I guess there's various kinds of activism we can do, but spreading the word and trying to give counter examples, but it's hard, We use this media to spread, and everyone says, oh, the internet is so great, it's democratizing everything, and it can be used that way, and you can spread really good information, but once people get attached to it, most of the stuff on there is more advertising. Most of the stuff on there is not necessarily wholesome, and the algorithms are trying to steer you to the things that they make money from, not to the things that tell you not to buy stuff, right? So it's tricky medium. But so on one level, you just have to say, well, it's going to take all of us changing. I mean, the mass of pollution comes from all of us using these things that create it. So we have to change. But if you just change yourself and then don't try to spread the word, then yeah, you're changing one part of 7 billion. It's pretty small, Although if you live in wealthy countries like we do, I mean, we should keep in mind 80% of the population still doesn't fly in planes of the world population. So we have enormously more impact than a lot of people. So it's not necessarily 1 in 7 billion, but it's 1 in maybe 3 billion anyway. So it's still pretty big. So getting the word out is crucial, whether it's first to our friends, helping form communities and trying to make the community a model. And then those communities can attract larger numbers of people. Or if you feel like you have access to reaching larger number of people through the internet or whatever, maybe that's great. I watch this guy, Russell Brand, sometimes on the internet. Do you know who he is?
I've heard of him. I've not watched anything from him, but yeah.
He rose to fame being kind of an outrageous comedian, basically, in England. And, breaking kind of a lot of taboos in his outrageousness, and but also being very, very bright, very smart, and very quick. He wasn't very well educated. He's from a working class background, but he was, taught himself a lot. But he was a drug addict and all this stuff. So he eventually recovered from that and started to get more serious in he would use his fame. He would go on these talk shows, and he was in movies and stuff like that. So he would be on a lot of the talk shows, and he was very funny. So people liked him. But he started challenging the whole thing about talk shows, and certainly the whole thing about fame and how it hadn't satisfied him. And he had tasted it, and it was a sour taste, and money too. And he started experimenting with meditation and spiritual practice, and really starting to advocate that. But it was on like the talk shows. You don't hear about that very much, So it was an interesting cultural phenomena. And he got more and more into his recovery, the 12-step thing, but making it a little less traditional 12-step and more kind of universal spiritual approach, and wrote some books on it. And so now he's not so mainstream famous. He still gets on some of the talk shows occasionally, but he mostly has podcasts and YouTube content. And he really advocates, quite a bit of radical things, and tries to use whatever left of his fame for that. And he has 2 channels. One is challenging kind of corporate capitalism, and the other is about spiritual practices. He's mostly in the kind of Kundalini yoga and TM tradition, but he's interviewed Eckhart Tolle and these kind of people quite a bit. So, someone like that, I mean, he has millions of followers. So, but he also really listens to his mail and stuff. So one person can reach people like that sometimes, and you never know how it expands. So yeah, if you just change your lifestyle and you're a hermit and you don't really care about talking to anyone, it's going to be pretty limited. But we are embedded in a wider world, whether it's actual interpersonal connections, which you don't know how it can spread, or whether it's the internet, or whether it's organizing you do. But yeah, we should be thinking about that. I am one person. But if we use that to be like, well, I'm not even going to change myself, well, then we know we're not doing anything. If we change ourselves, okay, one tiny drop is change. It's pretty minimal. But we know people and they see how we live. It's going to affect at least 30, 40 people, even if you're really private and not making any effort. And then those can affect other people. But if you do make an effort, you might reach a lot of people, depending on how skilled you are with internet stuff. I'm not, so far, I'm really unskilled in that realm. And I don't think I'm reaching very many people. But I'm always, and maybe it's not my job. Maybe someone I reach will be the person who reaches more people. But I'm also open to hearing how we can do that. I mean, but yeah, we want to affect as many people as we can. I mean, that's what love is. I mean, just with our practice, that's what we want to do too. You know, if you get awakened and then you're like, oh, I have no suffering personally now. I'm going to go sit in a cave for the rest of my life. You know, the Buddha, we have that in the Buddha story, right? He did it for a couple weeks. And then Indra, or maybe it's Brahma. I always thought it was Indra, but some stories have Brahma. Anyway, some god comes and says, try. Some people start with the people you were working with before. They have just a little dust in their eyes, right? That's a really important story. And, you know, Indra or Brahma is a part of our mind, the compassion part of our mind that arises and says, okay, now I have to take this out, because otherwise it's not really enlightenment then, you know? And the tradition has the word, Pratyeka Buddha for that, where you're a solo enlightened Buddha, but they kind of, at least the Mahayana looks down on it, right? And they should, because it's not a Buddha. It's a misunderstanding of awakening. It's a misunderstanding of freedom. Because real freedom, you recognize I'm not a person. I'm not anything. I'm this whole universe. And what pops into this whole universe? All these other beings. And we just love them because they're our universe. And so we have to do that spiritually, aside from strategy. We have to do that. And but strategically, that's necessary too, because nothing will change. Like you said, it's just one. But one person changing is already more than one person changing. We just don't recognize that because we're so consumed with me, right? That's the essential spiritual problem. We think, well, I've changed my thing and it's just about me. But no, it's not. It didn't even happen because of your personal choice, you know? You can understand that. I'm embedded in something moving that's universal and beyond my conceptual understanding. So let it happen. You know? Let it happen. Stay open and stay sensitive, and then it just happens. And yeah, we'll discover how it spreads.
So we can, in fact, make changes to ourselves. That's something that we actually can do, as opposed to, you know, other things which we should do but are much harder. And similarly, when we make changes for ourselves, that touches everyone in our life, and we can, intentionally cultivate that, where we reach out to people and share what we're doing and the changes that we're making, and educate and learn and exchange things that will help it to spread. Is that kind of how you see it?
Yeah, except that, you know, the way you said it is the conventional relative way, and that's how we usually think about things. That personal choice is the choice I can make, but ultimately you're not making any choice. Where did it come from? You know, ultimately you can't even make your own choice because there's no you there. So the ultimate perspective is, you don't want to let the ego use it as an excuse. Oh, well, if I can't make any choice, I'm going to make all the bad choices. No, you're still thinking you're making choices. You're just making hedonistic choices, and they won't bring you satisfaction. They won't bring you true freedom. So that hopefully won't last too long. And realizing that there's no separate self means that it's not really up to me to find out how to reach all those other people. It's fine to conventionally think that. And if you get some great idea like, oh, I'm going to make a YouTube channel, I'm going to make a podcast like you're doing, that's great. Do it, you know, especially if there's joy there. That's the universe working through you in that way. We feel like we're making choices. But ultimately, it's good to remember that it's beyond us. It's beyond us. Our personal choices are beyond us. And the way that it spreads is beyond us. And how it's going to happen is beyond us. So then what we're left with is we can use our figuring mind to a certain degree, but ultimately it's pretty limited, and we have to surrender to really our heart, what I would say was our heart. Now, saying our heart is a vague word, but that's what you have to do. You have to go to a vague word because it's not conceptually controlled. And we should do what's joyful, you know. That's ultimately what I've often said when people ask about decision problems. And I have problems with decision too, so it's not like I'm free of this.
Mm-hmm.
But and I can get OCD about my decisions. I mean, it's a mess sometimes.
Mm.
But ultimately I say, you know, do a reasonable amount of thinking if you think that's actually called for, which in a lot of difficult decisions, it's not called for. You've already done all the thinking you can do about it. It's just bouncing around in your head at that point. But if there's some knowledge accumulation to do, go ahead and collect that. But then ultimately, do what's the most beautiful step. Just ask yourself, what's the most beautiful step I can make? And beauty is another one of those vague words, but that means it takes you out of your intellectual control, because at some point you realize this is not, you know, if it's a hard decision, you're probably getting to that point where your intellect can balance it on both sides and it doesn't have much more role to do. So at that point, what does your heart say? What is the most beautiful step you can take? Not the easiest, but also not necessarily the hardest, because some people are like that. I always want to do the hardest thing, right? Not the most comfortable, not necessarily the most uncomfortable, but what's the most beautiful thing? And maybe nothing will come up, but I think it's a good way to pose it for yourself and see what resonates, because you're asking something deeper than your intellect to make the decision, and you're also asking what will lead to freedom. That's another way to put it. What will be the most freeing feeling thing? Because that's what you're going to do for joy and for love, and that's what's going to be the most effective. I really believe that. Some people ask me about like training, like hard training or whatever, and you know, I used to be pretty advocating of it, and now I step back and I have no idea what's best for people, you know, in terms of what will advance them in their spiritual practice. For some people, it's traditional hard training, but for some people, it's not. That can lead to breakdowns and, you know, ego attachment and all kinds of things. So what I really think is do what you really love. Do what you really love, which is not the same as do what's easy or do what you happen to have a whim about, you know, or is mildly entertaining. But try to find what you really love in a deep way. If you really love traditional training, which I did for a while, it's beautiful and it'll be transformative. But if you don't, or if that changes, it probably won't be, you know. It might be a drag and you have all kinds of guilt and shame and I haven't pushed myself hard enough. That's why I haven't broken through and blah, 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 blah. I mean, just find what you love. And the same with activism. You know, if you love doing it, it's going to be a beautiful thing. It doesn't even matter what happens with it. If you love that action you did with this group of people, you don't need to know whether it so-called failed or succeeded. It succeeded because it created beauty in the world and it influenced people in some way. And you don't know how that goes off into the world and how that affects things. It's beyond our thinking mind. So that's something that really we can learn from our non-dual spiritual practice that really can help us in activism is just do what you love, do what your heart says, and then let go of the consequences, because we know that it's beyond our thinking mind.
Well, I really appreciate you sharing all of this. And I think there's about a billion things more that I could ask you, and also that others wanted me to ask you. But I think there's also a lot to chew on here. And so it might be good to sort of wind down. And I just want to extend you the opportunity if there's anything else that you feel might be important to share, given everything that we have talked about, or something, you know, maybe anything that you'd like to point people to of your own work or what you're up to, or other things that they should know about. Anything that you'd like to share at all that feels relevant or appropriate.
Yeah, we covered a lot of bases. I think you asked the right questions and set me off. At the beginning, I was thinking, wow, what are we going to do for 2 hours? But I should know. I can be a big talker, obviously, and I should know that's usually not a problem with me. But one thing I want to say is just thanking you for doing what you're doing. I mean, this is a big part of the picture, is you're reaching out and making Sangha, and especially during COVID times, it has to be sometimes online. And even beyond COVID times, that's become our norm for our culture. So that's going to be a big part of the picture anyway. And, that's a beautiful part of practice and a beautiful part of the solution for trying to steer our culture in a healthier direction and save some of our natural world. So mostly I just want to encourage people to think about how they can contribute, kind of what I was just saying, but how they contribute in a way that really makes them feel free and in a way that they love. And that generally, I think that's going to have something to do with creating community. So how can we create community? And that's a big, question for me. And my group's really small. It meets on Sundays. I've started having a Friday night thing in this house because I have this house to use for now, not necessarily forever. We'll see what happens. But so I'm having people come over Friday nights, in small groups, to be careful with the pandemic situation. But it's been really nourishing for me and for other people. We just had dinner, and it's not, people know I'm a practitioner, and some of the people that come are practitioners themselves, and some are not. But and we end the evening usually with a little sitting, a little raga singing, but mostly it's just socializing and having dinner together and sharing, and that's just so important. And so it might just be like that. Open up a house you have to some people, start a sitting group if that's what you want, or any practice that you do, start a group like that. If you don't feel like you're a teacher, don't pretend to be one, but that doesn't mean you can't organize a group and start practicing together, and offer what you can. And when I started sitting with the group, it was someone that really was very humble and didn't consider themselves a teacher at all, but they knew how to give some zazen instruction and they knew how to start a group, and it was beautiful, and it touched a lot of people. So, so doing that, and any projects, even just having gatherings, even having artistic venues that put things on, and seeing how sustainability and environmental awareness and sensitivity can come into that, seeing how spiritual practice can come into that. I mean, with art, it's not a big divide, right? So I think, on the one hand, creating community is going to be very helpful for our environmental activism. On the other hand, it's just so good for our mental health. And then it's so essential for our spiritual development, that we should really connect with that and realize contemporary times, modern times, it's more than 100 years maybe in urbanized places, but now it's more all over the world. Isolation is such a big thing, and the breakdown of community is such a big thing. And, Sangha is, in the wider sense, not just Buddhist Sangha, but Sangha with spiritual undertones, community with spiritual undertones is, I think, so essential. So I think it's helpful for all of us to start framing what to do with our lives as, what can I offer that's the most beautiful, freeing, and coming from a place of love? And generally that's going to involve community. How can I foster community around something I can offer, and make those connections, whether it's live, whether it's online, whether it's both. So you're doing that. I'm just trying to do that in whatever clumsy way I'm doing. And if anyone I don't know if you can link my email or whatever, but if anyone wants to connect with me, I'm very happy to do that. I'm very happy to do more of these. I don't get a lot of opportunity. I used to give more talks and stuff in the neighborhood, but since COVID, at least, that's not happening so much. And also, there's a possibility of living in this house while I have it, or future communities I'd like to be a part of, that I'd like to reach out and connect with other people, whether they think they want to be in a community with me or whether they just want to brainstorm about being in communities. That's all. I would love to be a resource and included in that kind of thing. Yeah, that's all I can think of right now. If people want some direct action groups to connect with immediately, Extinction Rebellion that I mentioned before is one that I'm somewhat excited about. Who knows how it will develop in the States? It's still really small, but They're doing some good things. So you can look that up, of course, online. And I work with Food Not Bombs. So that's a nice resource. It's many thousands of chapters around the world now. They're all different, and they're not necessarily involving spiritual practice, although maybe it always is when you're trying to give food to people out of compassion. So that's something I work with. Nothing else is coming to mind right now. I have a website that very few people visit, but you can look at that. I haven't been too active with writing, but all my talks are going on, or most of them are going on YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
Touching Earth Sangha channel. So
I'll be linking to both of those and your email as well in the show notes. So, well, thank you again so much for your time. I so enjoyed this conversation, and it's touched me, and I'll hope that it touches others as well. And thank you so much for your time and for your practice and your life and your dedication.
Yeah, and same to you. Thanks for making this opportunity happen and doing the work you're doing. I think it's crucial and beautiful. And I hope we stay connected, and I hope it leads to other connections with other people who get to see this.
Yes, I think they will.
All right.